I never thought I would be standing in my driveway at 6 in the morning, watching a police cruiser pull up while my snow removal crew nervously gripped their shovels. But here, I was in the middle of February in Rochester, Minnesota, living through what had to be the most absurd confrontation of my entire adult life. The snow had started falling 3 days ago and hadn't stopped, blanketing our neighborhood in almost 2 feet of the white stuff. And I had done everything by the book to get my driveway and walkway cleared before the city started issuing fines for unshoveled sidewalks. My name is Isaac Campbell, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision for exactly 8 months when this nightmare began. I bought my house in June of last year, a nice 3-bedroom ranch with a 2-car garage and a decent-sized yard that my wife Laura and I fell in love with the moment we saw it. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, friendly neighbors who waved when you drove by. What I didn't realize was that lurking behind all that suburban charm was an HOA president named Patricia Hendricks, who apparently had nothing better to do than make everyone's life miserable. I first encountered Patricia about 2 weeks after we moved in. She showed up at my door on a Saturday morning with a clipboard and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was probably in her mid-50s, with that specific haircut that seemed to be required for women who enjoyed making complaints. You know the one, short in the back, and somehow defying gravity in the front. She wore a pastel pink cardigan despite it being nearly 90 degrees outside and had reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, though her tone suggested she was doing anything but welcoming me. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to stop by and go over a few things with you." I invited her in, not knowing any better at the time. Laura was at work, so it was just me and Patricia sitting in our living room while she proceeded to list off about 30 different rules and regulations that I supposedly needed to follow. No trash cans visible from the street except on collection day. No vehicles parked in driveways overnight. They had to be in the garage. No lawn decorations except during approved holiday periods, and even those had to meet specific size requirements. The list went on and on. "These rules are in place to maintain property values," Patricia explained, as if that justified the insanity. "We all purchased homes here with certain expectations, and the HOA exists to ensure those expectations are met." I nodded along politely, though internally I was already beginning to regret our decision to buy in an HOA neighborhood. My previous house had been in an older part of town with no such restrictions, and I missed that freedom already. Over the next few months, I learned just how serious Patricia was about enforcement. She sent me a violation notice because I left my garage door open for 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon while I was organizing tools. Another notice arrived when Laura planted some flowers in our front bed that weren't on the approved plant list. The fines were $25 per violation, and they added up quickly. Other neighbors confided in me that they had similar experiences. John Martinez, who lived 2 doors down, told me he had received a violation for having his Christmas lights up on December 26th, one day after the approved display period ended. "She drives around with a camera," John told me one evening when we were both checking our mail. "Takes pictures of everything. I swear she has nothing else to do with her time. But I tried to play by the rules as best as I could. I paid the fines, fixed the violations, and generally attempted to stay off Patricia's radar." Which brings us back to February and the snowstorm that would finally push this situation over the edge. The weather reports had been warning about the storm for days. A massive system was moving down from Canada, and meteorologists were predicting anywhere from 18 to 30 inches of accumulation over a 72-hour period. I knew from the HOA bylaws that homeowners were responsible for clearing their sidewalks within 24 hours of snowfall ceasing, and with this much snow, there was no way I could handle it myself with just a shovel. I called around to several snow removal companies, but most were already booked solid. Finally, I found a crew run by a guy named Miguel Santos who said he could fit me in. His price was steep, $300 for the driveway, walkway, and sidewalk, but I didn't have much choice. We scheduled him to come by on February 14th, the day after the snow was supposed to stop. "I'm going to need a permit from the city," Miguel told me over the phone. "For commercial snow removal operations, it's required. I'll handle getting it, but I need your address and property information." I gave him everything he needed, and he assured me he would have all the proper documentation when his crew arrived. I also checked the HOA rules about snow removal services, and while there were plenty of regulations about lawn care companies and exterior maintenance contractors, there was nothing that prohibited hiring a snow removal crew. I made sure to keep copies of everything just in case Patricia decided to make an issue out of it. The snow started falling on February 11th, a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, we already had 8 inches, and it just kept coming. Laura and I worked from home, so we weren't too worried about getting out, but I watched through the window as the accumulation grew deeper and deeper. By Saturday morning, my car in the driveway was completely buried, and the snow was still falling steadily. It finally stopped late Saturday night. When I looked out Sunday morning, the entire neighborhood was transformed into a winter wonderland. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't such a massive pain to deal with. According to the news, we had gotten 22 inches, which was the most Rochester had seen in a single storm in over a decade. Miguel called me at 7 that morning. "We're starting our rounds," he said. "We should be at your place around 9. The roads are pretty rough, so it might take longer than expected." I told him that was fine and spent the next couple hours drinking coffee and watching neighbors begin the arduous task of digging out. Most people were focusing on their driveways first, trying to create enough space to at least get their cars out. The city plows had been through once, but they had left those massive walls of packed snow at the end of everyone's driveway, which meant even more work. At 9:15, I saw Miguel's truck turn onto our street. It was a heavy-duty pickup with a plow attachment on the front, and he had 2 other guys with him. They pulled up in front of my house, and I went outside to meet them. "Isaac Campbell?" Miguel asked, extending a gloved hand. He was probably in his early 30s, with a friendly smile despite clearly having already put in several hours of hard work that morning. "That's me," I said, shaking his hand. "Thanks for fitting me in." "No problem. Let me show you the permit real quick." He pulled out a plastic document holder from inside his coat and showed me an official-looking form from the city of Rochester, stamped and signed, authorizing Santos snow removal services to operate commercially within city limits. Everything looked legitimate to me. "Perfect," I said. "The driveway is obviously the priority, but I need the walkway to the front door and the sidewalk cleared too. There's a fire hydrant over there that probably needs to be dug out as well." "We'll take care of it," Miguel assured me. "Should take us about an hour, maybe 90 minutes with this much snow." I went back inside, grateful that I didn't have to tackle this job myself. Through the window, I watched Miguel and his crew get to work. They were efficient and professional, using a combination of the truck plow for the heavy stuff and shovels for the more detailed work around the walkway and steps. I was in the kitchen making another pot of coffee when Laura called out from the living room. "Isaac, you need to see this." I walked in to find her standing at the window with an expression that was half amused and half concerned. Following her gaze, I saw Patricia Hendricks marching down the middle of the street, still somehow managing to look authoritative despite wearing moon boots and a puffy winter coat that made her look like a pastel marshmallow. "Oh no," I muttered. "Is she seriously coming here?" Laura asked. "Of course she is." I watched as Patricia stopped at the end of my driveway, hands on her hips, observing the snow removal crew with obvious disapproval. Miguel noticed her and said something I couldn't hear, but Patricia shook her head emphatically and pointed at his truck. Then she pulled out her phone. "She's taking pictures," Laura said. "What is her problem?" "Existing seems to be enough for her," I replied, grabbing my coat. I had a bad feeling about where this was headed. By the time I got outside, Patricia was on her phone, and I heard her say something about unauthorized commercial activity. Miguel and his crew had stopped working and were standing by their truck looking confused. "Patricia," I called out as I approached, "is there a problem?" She lowered her phone slightly and fixed me with a look that could have frozen the already frozen street even more. "Mr. Campbell, you are in violation of HOA regulations by hiring an unauthorized commercial service to operate on neighborhood property." "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "I checked the bylaws. There's nothing prohibiting snow removal services." Section 12, Paragraph 4, Patricia recited from memory, because of course she had the entire rule book memorized. "All exterior contractor services must be approved by the HOA board at least 48 hours in advance. You did not submit a request for approval." I had to take a deep breath to avoid saying something I would regret. "Patricia, that section is about permanent installations and modifications. It's meant for things like roof work or landscaping projects. This is snow removal. It's temporary maintenance and it's legally required by the city." "The rule is clear," she insisted. "Commercial services require approval. These men need to leave immediately, or I will be forced to call the police." Miguel stepped forward, his expression still friendly but with an edge of frustration. "Madam, we have all the proper permits and licenses. We're authorized by the city to provide these services." "I don't care about your city permits," Patricia snapped. "This is a private community with our own rules and regulations. You are trespassing, and I am well within my rights to have you removed." "You can't be serious," I said. "I hired them to clear my property, which is my responsibility. The city will fine me if I don't get this done within 24 hours of the snowfall stopping." "Then you should have submitted a request for approval," Patricia replied coldly, "or cleared it yourself." "There's no way I can clear 2 feet of snow by myself in time to avoid a city fine," I argued. "Be reasonable." But reason was clearly not something Patricia was interested in. She raised her phone again. "I'm calling the police now. These men are trespassing and conducting unauthorized commercial activity." "This is insane," Laura said, having joined me outside. "Patricia, this is harassment." Patricia ignored her and spoke into her phone. "Yes, I need to report trespassing and illegal commercial activity in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision." She gave our address and then added, "There are 3 men here with a commercial truck conducting unauthorized snow removal. The homeowner did not receive approval from the HOA." I looked at Miguel apologetically. "I'm really sorry about this. I had no idea she was going to pull something like this." "It's not your fault, man," Miguel said, though he looked worried. "But I can't afford to get in trouble with the cops. We're running a legitimate business." "You won't get in trouble," I assured him. You have all the proper documentation. This is just her trying to throw her weight around." We all stood there in the cold waiting for the police to arrive, which they did about 10 minutes later. A Rochester PD cruiser pulled up, and an officer stepped out. He was maybe in his late 20s, with a name tag that read Officer Davis. He surveyed the scene with an expression that suggested this was not how he wanted to spend his Sunday morning. "Someone called about trespassing?" Officer Davis asked. Patricia immediately launched into her explanation, gesturing dramatically at Miguel and his crew. "Officer, I am Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. These men are conducting unauthorized commercial activity in our neighborhood." The homeowner, Mr. Campbell, did not receive proper approval from the HOA board before hiring them. Officer Davis turned to me. "Sir, did you hire these men?" "Yes, I did," I confirmed. "I hired Santos snow removal services to clear my driveway and sidewalk. They have all the proper city permits and licenses." "May I see the permits?" Officer Davis asked Miguel. Miguel handed over the document holder and the officer examined the paperwork carefully. He took his time, checking the dates, the stamps, the signatures. Meanwhile, Patricia stood there with her arms crossed, clearly confident that she was about to be vindicated. After what felt like an eternity, Officer Davis handed the papers back to Miguel and turned to Patricia. "Madam, these permits are all in order. This is a licensed snow removal service authorized to operate within city limits." "But they don't have HOA approval," Patricia insisted. "That's not a criminal matter," Officer Davis said. "If there's a dispute about HOA rules, that's a civil issue that needs to be resolved between the homeowner and the HOA. There's no trespassing here. Mr. Campbell owns this property and has the right to hire contractors for maintenance." Patricia's face was turning red. "Officer, you don't understand. Our neighborhood has rules and regulations. We can't just have any commercial operation coming in whenever they want." "Madam, with all due respect, your HOA rules don't supersede city ordinances," Officer Davis explained patiently. "The city requires homeowners to clear their sidewalks within 24 hours of snowfall. Mr. Campbell is in compliance with that ordinance by hiring a licensed service. Your HOA cannot prevent him from meeting his legal obligations." "This is ridiculous," Patricia sputtered. "I pay taxes. I have rights." "Yes, you do," Officer Davis agreed. "But one of those rights is not preventing your neighbor from hiring legal contractors to maintain his property. Now, making a false police report, however, that is something I need to address." Patricia's expression changed from indignant to concerned. "False report? I didn't make a false report. Madam, you called 911 to report trespassing and illegal commercial activity. Both of those claims are false. This is a legitimate business with proper authorization conducting work at the request of the property owner. Filing a false police report is a misdemeanor in Minnesota." "I didn't know it was false when I called," Patricia protested. "I genuinely believed there was a violation occurring." Officer Davis pulled out a citation book from his belt. "Madam, you're president of the HOA. You should know the difference between HOA regulations and actual laws. You wasted police resources on a civil dispute that should have been handled through your own internal processes. I'm issuing you a citation for filing a false police report." I watched in stunned silence as Officer Davis wrote out the ticket. Patricia's face went from red to white, and for the first time since I had met her, she seemed completely at a loss for words. "This fine is $275, Officer Davis said, handing her the citation. "You have 30 days to pay or contest it in court. Now I suggest you allow these gentlemen to complete their work so Mr. Campbell can comply with city ordinances." Patricia took the ticket with shaking hands, stared at it for a long moment, and then looked up at me with pure venom in her eyes. "This isn't over, Mr. Campbell." "Actually, I think it is," I replied, trying not to sound too satisfied. Patricia turned and trudged back down the street toward her own house, leaving tracks in the snow that somehow looked angry. Officer Davis turned to me with a slight smile. "Sorry you had to deal with that. We get calls like this more often than you'd think. HOA disputes that turn into police matters because someone doesn't understand the law." "I appreciate you setting the record straight," I said, "just doing my job." He nodded to Miguel and his crew. "You gentlemen are free to continue your work. Have a good day." As the police cruiser pulled away, Miguel let out a long breath. "Man, that was intense. I've been doing this for 5 years and I've never had someone call the cops on us." "Welcome to life in an HOA neighborhood," I said wryly. "Thanks for sticking around." "No problem. Let's get this finished up for you." The crew went back to work, and I stood there for a moment watching Patricia's retreating figure. Laura came up beside me and slipped her arm through mine. "That was something," she said. "Yeah, I don't think Patricia is going to let this go." "Probably not. But at least you were in the right." We went back inside, and I watched from the window as Miguel and his crew finished clearing the driveway and sidewalk. They did an excellent job, even digging out the fire hydrant as I had requested. When they were done, Miguel came to the door and I paid him in cash, adding an extra $50 for the trouble. "Thanks for everything," I told him, "and I'm really sorry about the drama." "Hey, not your fault," Miguel said. "Just glad it worked out. You need anything else, give me a call." After they left, I thought that might be the end of it. The snow was cleared. Patricia had been fined by the police, and surely she would realize that she had overstepped and back off. But I should have known better. 2 days later, I received a formal notice from the HOA. It was a thick envelope containing multiple pages of violations, dating back to the day I moved in. Every single fine I had already paid was listed again, along with new violations I had never heard about. Apparently, my house number wasn't the right size according to HOA standards. My mailbox was half an inch too far from the curb. The mulch in my flower beds wasn't the approved shade of brown. And of course, there was a $1,000 fine for hiring an unauthorized contractor without board approval. I sat at the kitchen table reading through the document in disbelief. The total amount they were claiming I owed was over $3,000. "This is retaliation," Laura said, reading over my shoulder. "She's making this stuff up because she's angry about getting that ticket." "Half of these violations are completely bogus," I agreed. "But what do we do about it?" Laura thought for a moment. "We need a lawyer. This has gone way too far." She was right. I spent the next morning calling around to attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. Most were expensive, and several told me that HOA cases were notoriously difficult because the associations had a lot of legal leeway in how they enforced their rules. But finally, I found a lawyer named Rebecca Walsh, who seemed confident she could help. Rebecca's office was in downtown Rochester, in one of those converted historic buildings that somehow managed to be charming and professional at the same time. She was probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "So, let me make sure I understand the situation," Rebecca said after I had explained everything. "You hired a licensed snow removal service with proper city permits. The HOA president called the police, who determined you were in compliance with all laws and issued her a citation for filing a false report. And now, she's hitting you with thousands of dollars in alleged violations, many of which are either already resolved or questionable to begin with. That's the situation, I confirmed. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at her lips. This is pretty clear-cut retaliation, which is illegal under Minnesota law. HOAs have authority to enforce their rules, but they can't use that authority to punish homeowners for exercising their legal rights. You had every right to hire that snow removal service, and you had every right to have the police verify that you were in compliance with the law. Patricia Hendricks is abusing her position. So what can we do? I asked. Several things, Rebecca said. First, we're going to respond to this notice with a formal letter disputing all the charges and putting the HOA on notice that their actions constitute harassment and retaliation. Second, we're going to request copies of all HOA board meeting minutes, financial records, and enforcement actions taken against other homeowners. I want to see if there's a pattern of selective or unfair enforcement. Can they refuse to provide those records? I asked. They can try, but Minnesota law requires HOAs to make certain documents available to homeowners. If they refuse, we can compel them through legal action. Third, I'm going to recommend that you start documenting everything. Every interaction with Patricia, every notice you receive, every conversation with other homeowners about their experiences. We need to build a comprehensive record of the HOA's behavior. This is going to cost a fortune, isn't it? I said, already dreading the answer. It might, Rebecca admitted. But here's the thing. If we can prove harassment and retaliation, you can potentially recover your legal fees from the HOA. Plus, if other homeowners have similar complaints, we might be able to build a class action case, which would distribute the costs. That got my attention. You think other people would join in? Based on what you've told me about Patricia's behavior, I would be shocked if you were the only one with complaints. HOA presidents who abuse their authority usually don't limit it to just one person. I left Rebecca's office feeling more hopeful than I had in days. She drafted a letter to the HOA that was professional but firm, laying out exactly why the violations were invalid and warning that continued harassment would result in legal action. She sent it certified mail so there would be proof of delivery. While waiting for a response, I started talking to my neighbors more openly about their experiences with the HOA. What I discovered was both validating and infuriating. John Martinez showed me a file folder 3 inches thick, filled with violation notices he had received over the past 2 years. Everything from his grass being allegedly too long, which it wasn't, to having a decorative flag in his yard during a non-approved period. He had paid over $2,000 in fines just to avoid further conflict. I keep telling my wife we should just move, John said. But we love this house, and it's not right that Patricia gets to chase people out of the neighborhood because she's on a power trip. Karen Sullivan, who lived across the street, had an even worse story. Patricia had targeted her garden, claiming the vegetables she was growing in her backyard were visible from the street and therefore violated the aesthetic standards. Never mind that you could only see the garden if you actually walked into Karen's backyard and looked specifically at that corner. Karen had been forced to tear out tomato plants and cucumber vines that she had spent months nurturing. She came to my door with a camera, Karen told me, still upset about it months later. Took pictures of my garden like she was collecting evidence of a crime. All I wanted was to grow some fresh vegetables for my family. The more people I talked to, the clearer the pattern became. Patricia didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized them. If she didn't like someone, or if they challenged her authority in any way, she would find violations where none existed and pile on fines until the homeowner either paid up or moved away. I shared all of this information with Rebecca, who was extremely interested in what I had found. "This is excellent," she said. "We're building a strong case for selective enforcement and abuse of authority. Keep gathering information." About a week after Rebecca sent her letter, I received a response from the HOA. But it wasn't from Patricia. Instead, it was from the HOA's attorney, a lawyer named Donald Pritchard. His letter was dismissive and condescending, claiming that all the violations were legitimate and that the HOA had every right to enforce its rules as it saw fit. The letter also accused me of harassment and threatened legal action if I continued to interfere with the HOA's lawful operations. "They're trying to intimidate you," Rebecca explained when I showed her the letter. "This is a standard tactic. They hope that threatening counter-suits will make you back down. We're not backing down." Rebecca fired back with another letter, this time formally requesting the HOA records under Minnesota law and reiterating that the violations were invalid and retaliatory. She also included a detailed timeline of events, from the snow removal incident to the police citation to the sudden flood of violation notices. The implication was clear. This was a coordinated effort to punish me for embarrassing Patricia. Things escalated quickly after that. Patricia started showing up at my house unannounced, claiming she needed to conduct inspections of my property. I refused to let her in, which led to more violation notices for failure to cooperate with HOA officials. She also began contacting my neighbors, asking them questions about whether I was following the rules, whether they had seen any violations, whether I was causing problems in the neighborhood. "She came to my door yesterday," John told me. "Wanted to know if you were a good neighbor, if there were any issues with your property. I told her you were fine and that she should leave you alone. She didn't like that." Sure enough, John started receiving more violation notices too. It became clear that Patricia saw him as an ally of mine and was punishing him for it. But Patricia made a critical mistake. In her zeal to find violations and justify the fines, she started making claims that were not just petty but demonstrably false. She sent me a notice claiming that I had painted my house without HOA approval, which would have been a major violation with a significant fine attached. The problem was, I hadn't painted my house. It was still the exact same color it had been when I bought it 8 months ago. I had photos from the original listing, from the home inspection, from the day we moved in, all showing the house was the same shade of beige it had always been. "This is huge," Rebecca said when I showed her the notice. "She's filing fraudulent violation claims now. This goes beyond harassment and retaliation. This is potentially fraud." We gathered evidence, documenting the house's color with photographs, pulling up the original MLS listing, even getting a statement from the previous owner confirming that the house had not been painted in over 5 years. Then, Rebecca filed a formal complaint against the HOA with the Minnesota Attorney General's office. The complaint outlined everything: the initial snow removal incident, the retaliatory fines, the selective enforcement against me and other homeowners, the harassment, and now the fraudulent violation claim about painting my house. We included sworn statements from John, Karen, and 3 other neighbors who had experienced similar treatment from Patricia. We included copies of all the violation notices, the police report from the snow removal incident, and the citation Officer Davis had issued to Patricia. The Attorney General's office took the complaint seriously. Within 2 weeks, an investigator contacted me to schedule an interview. Her name was Linda Morrison, and she was with the Consumer Protection Division. She came to my house on a Thursday afternoon, spent 2 hours going through all the documentation I had gathered, and asked detailed questions about every interaction with Patricia and the HOA. "This is one of the more egregious cases I've seen," Linda told me. HOAs are supposed to maintain property values and create harmonious communities. What you're describing is harassment, retaliation, and potentially extortion. "Extortion," I repeated, surprised by the word. "Demanding money under false pretenses," Linda explained. "These violation fines, if they're based on fabricated or exaggerated claims, could constitute extortion under Minnesota law. We're going to investigate thoroughly." Over the next month, the investigation expanded. Linda interviewed other homeowners in the neighborhood, obtained HOA financial records through a subpoena, and reviewed years of board meeting minutes and violation notices. What she found was shocking even to me, and I had been living through it. Patricia had been systematically targeting homeowners for years. There was a clear pattern. She would identify someone she didn't like, usually because they had questioned her authority or simply because they were new to the neighborhood, and then she would bombard them with violation notices until they either paid thousands of dollars in fines or sold their homes and left. Over the past 4 years, 17 families had moved out of Meadowbrook Estates specifically because of conflicts with Patricia and the HOA. Even worse, the investigation revealed financial irregularities. HOA dues were supposed to be deposited into a community account and used for neighborhood maintenance and improvements, but large amounts of money were unaccounted for. Patricia had been using HOA funds to pay her personal legal fees for matters unrelated to the association. She had also been pocketing some of the fine money instead of depositing it into the HOA account. "This is fraud," Linda told me during an update call. "We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars that have been misappropriated. I'm recommending criminal charges." I was stunned. What had started as a dispute over snow removal had uncovered years of financial fraud and abuse of power. In early April, the Minnesota Attorney General's office announced formal charges against Patricia Hendricks. She was charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and extortion. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had been afraid to speak up against Patricia suddenly came forward with their own stories. The flood of additional complaints and evidence made the case against her even stronger. The HOA board, or what was left of it after Patricia's arrest, held an emergency meeting. They voted to suspend all pending violation notices pending a full review, and they hired an outside management company to take over the HOA's operations while things got sorted out. They also voted to terminate Patricia's position as president, effective immediately. The trial took place in July. By that point, the prosecution had a mountain of evidence against Patricia. Financial records showed she had embezzled over $40,000 from the HOA over a 4-year period. Testimony from dozens of homeowners established a pattern of harassment and abuse of power. The fake violation notice about painting my house was entered as evidence of fraud. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she had simply been doing her job as HOA president, that the financial irregularities were accounting errors, and that the violation notices were all legitimate enforcement actions. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Patricia to 18 months in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA and to individual homeowners who had been wrongly fined. For me specifically, the court ordered her to reimburse all the fines I had paid, plus my legal fees, plus damages for harassment and emotional distress. The total came to over $15,000, But the money wasn't really the point. What mattered was that Patricia's reign of terror over our neighborhood was finally over. The new management company that took over the HOA was professional and reasonable. They reviewed all the rules and regulations, eliminated the ones that were overly restrictive or impossible to enforce fairly, and established clear procedures for how violations would be handled going forward. The neighborhood itself felt different after everything that happened. People were friendlier, more willing to help each other out, less stressed about every little detail of their properties. John Martinez finally planted the decorative bushes his wife had wanted for years. Karen Sullivan put in a new, even bigger vegetable garden. And I made sure to hire Miguel's snow removal crew again the following winter, this time without any interference. One Saturday morning in September, almost exactly a year after the snow removal incident, I was outside mowing the lawn when John walked over with a cold beer for each of us. "Can you believe it's been a year?" he asked, handing me the bottle. "Honestly, it feels like a lifetime ago and yesterday at the same time," I replied. "I keep thinking about how different things could have been," John said. "If you hadn't stood up to her, if you hadn't gotten that lawyer, Patricia would still be running this place into the ground." "I just wanted to get my driveway cleared," I said with a laugh. "I never intended to take down the HOA president. But you did. And the whole neighborhood is better for it." We clinked our bottles together and stood there in the late summer sunshine, watching kids ride bikes down the street and neighbors chatting across fences. It was the kind of peaceful suburban scene I had imagined when Laura and I first decided to buy a house in Meadowbrook Estates. It just took a police officer, a citation, a lawyer, an attorney general investigation, and a criminal trial to get there. Laura came outside to join us, and we all talked about plans for the upcoming neighborhood block party that the new HOA board was organizing. It was going to be held in the community park, with food trucks and games for kids and live music. The kind of event that brought people together instead of driving them apart. "We should see if Miguel wants to bring his family," Laura suggested. "He did kind of start this whole thing in a way." "That's a great idea," I agreed. "I'll give him a call." As it turned out, Miguel was thrilled to be invited. He showed up to the block party with his wife and 2 young daughters, and people kept coming up to thank him for being part of the chain of events that led to Patricia's downfall. He took it all in stride, laughing and saying he was just glad his permits had been in order that day. Officer Davis even stopped by the block party, not in an official capacity, but because he lived in a neighborhood nearby and had heard about the event. I thanked him again for how he had handled the situation that February morning. "I just did my job," he said, echoing what he had told me the first time. "But I'm glad it led to something positive. We see too many HOA disputes that never get resolved. People just suffer in silence because they don't think they have any recourse." "I almost did that," I admitted. "If it hadn't been for the fraudulent violation notice about the house painting, I might have just paid the fines and tried to keep my head down." "That's what people like Patricia count on," Officer Davis said. "They know most people won't fight back. That's why it's important when someone does." The block party lasted well into the evening, and as Laura and I walked home later that night, I felt genuinely content for the first time since we had moved to Meadowbrook Estates. Our house looked welcoming in the twilight, the lawn perfectly maintained, the flowers in the beds blooming beautifully. It looked exactly like it had when Patricia had been in charge, but somehow it felt completely different. It felt like home. The legal fallout continued for months after Patricia's sentencing. Several homeowners filed civil suits against her for damages, and while she didn't have much money left after paying court-ordered restitution, The judgments against her meant she would be paying back the community for years to come. Her house went into foreclosure, and when it was finally sold, the proceeds went toward her debts. The new HOA board, which included John Martinez as treasurer, implemented sweeping reforms. Violation notices now required approval from at least 3 board members before being issued. Homeowners had the right to appeal any violation and to have their case heard by the full board, not just the president. Financial records were published quarterly and made available to all residents. And perhaps most importantly, the board voted to reduce the scope of the rules significantly, focusing only on issues that genuinely affected property values or safety, not petty aesthetic preferences. Rebecca Walsh, my lawyer, used our case as the foundation for several other HOA reform efforts in Minnesota. She gave interviews to local news stations about HOA abuse and helped draft model legislation that would give homeowners more protections against overreaching associations. Some of those protections were eventually incorporated into Minnesota law, creating precedents that would help countless other people dealing with similar situations. As for me and Laura, we continued to live happily in our house in Meadowbrook Estates. We never had another serious conflict with the HOA, though there were occasional minor disputes that got resolved through the proper channels with reasonable discussions and compromises. We became good friends with John and Karen and several other neighbors who had been part of the fight against Patricia's regime. Every winter, when the first major snowfall came, I would call Miguel to schedule his crew to clear our driveway. And every time, I would think back to that February morning when a simple snow removal job turned into something much bigger. It was a reminder that standing up for yourself, even when it seems easier to just go along, can make a real difference. The neighborhood children started using our street for sledding because the new HOA didn't have absurd rules about winter recreational activities. Holiday decorations became more creative and personal, reflecting the actual preferences of the families who lived there rather than some arbitrary standard. People painted their front doors in colors they actually liked. Small changes, maybe, but they added up to a community that felt alive and authentic rather than sterile and controlled. I ran into Donald Pritchard, Patricia's lawyer, at the grocery store one afternoon about 2 years after everything had concluded. He recognized me and actually apologized. "I want you to know that I was just representing my client to the best of my ability," he said. "But after everything came out in the trial, I realized I had been helping her perpetuate a pretty terrible situation. I don't do HOA work anymore." "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. "It takes integrity to acknowledge when you've been on the wrong side of something." We shook hands, and I felt like that was another piece of closure falling into place. Laura and I hosted Thanksgiving dinner that year, inviting both our families and several neighbors. As we sat around the table, John stood up to make a toast. "I want to thank Isaac for being stubborn enough not to let Patricia Hendricks ruin this neighborhood," he said, raising his glass. "A lot of us were ready to give up, to just accept that living here meant living under her thumb. But you fought back, and look at us now. We have a neighborhood worth living in again." Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt Laura squeeze my hand under the table. I hadn't set out to be a hero or a reformer. I had just wanted to clear my driveway without getting in trouble. But sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to larger changes. The thing about HOAs is that they can be a good thing when they're run properly. They can maintain common areas, organize community events, and ensure a basic level of property maintenance that benefits everyone. The problem comes when people like Patricia use them as instruments of power and control, when they forget that the association exists to serve the homeowners, not the other way around. In the years that followed, Meadowbrook Estates became known in Rochester as a model for HOA reform. Other neighborhoods looked at what we had done and implemented similar changes. The story of Patricia's downfall became a cautionary tale that was shared at HOA board meetings across the state. Property values in our neighborhood actually increased once the oppressive enforcement regime was dismantled, proving that strict rules and harsh penalties don't actually help communities thrive. Miguel's snow removal business grew significantly, partly because people heard about how professional and properly licensed he was. He ended up hiring 3 more crews and expanding his services to include landscaping and lawn care. He sometimes joked that getting the police called on him was the best advertising he ever could have asked for. Officer Davis was promoted to sergeant and eventually became a community liaison officer, working specifically on quality of life issues in residential neighborhoods. He told me once that our case had opened his eyes to how often police get called for situations that aren't actually criminal matters, but rather civil disputes that people try to escalate by involving law enforcement. "We need better training on HOA law," he said, "so officers know when to issue citations for false reports and when to just diffuse the situation and send people to handle it through proper channels." Rebecca Walsh continued to be my lawyer for general matters, though fortunately I never needed her HOA expertise again. She became something of a local celebrity in the legal community for her work on HOA reform, and she never had trouble finding clients after our case made the news. As for Patricia, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she served 14 months of her sentence and was released early for good behavior. She moved to a different city, somewhere in Iowa, to live with family. I never saw her again, and I was fine with that. I didn't hold a grudge, but I also didn't feel any need for further contact. She had abused her power, gotten caught, paid the consequences, and now we all got to move on with our lives. The final chapter of the whole saga came about 3 years after the initial snow removal incident. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA board decided to establish an annual award for community service. They named it the Isaac Campbell Award for standing up for what's right. I was simultaneously honored and embarrassed when they announced it at the annual meeting. "I didn't do anything special," I protested when John, who was now president of the HOA board, presented me with a plaque. "I just didn't want to pay fraudulent fines." "That's exactly the point," John replied. "You stood up for yourself when it would have been easier to just comply. You fought back against injustice even when the outcome was uncertain. That's what we want to celebrate and encourage in this community." The first recipient of the award, other than me, was Karen Sullivan, for her work establishing a community garden that brought neighbors together and provided fresh vegetables for families struggling with food insecurity. The second year it went to a teenager named Marcus, who organized a snow shoveling volunteer program for elderly residents. Each year, the award recognized someone who embodied the principle that communities work best when people stand up for each other and for what's right. Standing in my driveway on a cold February morning 5 years after the original incident, watching a new snow removal crew clear the latest winter storm, I reflected on everything that had changed. The house was the same. The street was the same. But the feeling of the neighborhood was completely different. People weren't afraid anymore. They weren't constantly looking over their shoulders wondering if they were violating some obscure rule. They were just living their lives, taking care of their properties because they took pride in their homes, not because they feared fines and harassment. A new family had moved into Patricia's old house, a young couple with twin babies. They were friendly and excited to be part of the community. I had helped them move some furniture in when they first arrived, and they had been surprised at how welcoming everyone was. We almost bought in a different neighborhood, the husband, whose name was David, told me. But everyone we talked to said Meadowbrook Estates had the best HOA in the city. They said you guys figured out how to do it right. It took some work to get here, I admitted, not going into all the details. But yeah, we have a good thing going now. Laura came out with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, and we stood together watching the snow crew work. They were a different company than Miguel's. He had gotten too busy with commercial contracts to do residential work anymore, but they were equally professional and properly licensed. You ever think about what would have happened if Officer Davis hadn't handled things the way he did? Laura asked. All the time, I said. If he had just told us to work it out ourselves, or if he had taken Patricia's side because she sounded authoritative, everything would have been different. We probably would have paid those fraudulent fines and eventually moved away like so many other families did. One person doing the right thing at the right time, Laura mused. That's all it takes sometimes. She was right. Officer Davis had done his job properly, following the law and the evidence rather than just accepting Patricia's version of events. That had set everything else in motion. The citation he issued became crucial evidence in the Attorney General's investigation. His report documented the beginning of Patricia's retaliatory campaign against me. One police officer, doing his job correctly on a random Sunday morning, had inadvertently triggered the chain of events that freed an entire neighborhood from years of abuse. I finished my hot chocolate and went back inside to get ready for work. The house was warm and comfortable, exactly the kind of home Laura and I had dreamed of owning. Through the window, I could see the snow-covered street, the neat rows of houses, the carefully maintained properties. It looked like a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, the kind you see in magazines or movies. But what made it truly special wasn't the aesthetics. It was the knowledge that the people who lived here were free to make it their home without fear. They could paint their front doors, plant their gardens, hire snow removal crews, and live their lives without someone constantly looking for reasons to fine and harass them. That February morning 5 years ago, when Miguel and his crew arrived to clear my driveway, I never could have imagined where it would lead. A simple home maintenance task had become the catalyst for exposing corruption, reforming an abusive system, and ultimately creating a better community for everyone who lived here. All because I had done the responsible thing and hired a licensed contractor, because Miguel had brought his proper permits, because Officer Davis had checked the documentation and followed the law, and because I had been stubborn enough to fight back when Patricia tried to retaliate. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never intended to fight. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. And sometimes justice prevails in the most unexpected ways. As I drove to work that morning, passing the neat rows of houses in Meadowbrook Estates, I felt grateful for everything that had happened, even the difficult parts. We had been tested as a community and had come out stronger on the other side. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, no place is, but it was ours in a way that felt authentic and earned. The snow continued to fall, blanketing everything in white, and I knew that when I got home that evening, my driveway would be clear and safe. Not because I was afraid of fines or violations, but because I had taken responsibility for my property and hired good people to help me maintain it. That was how it was supposed to work, and after years of fighting for it, that was exactly how it did work. In the end, that February morning when Patricia called the police on my snow removal crew turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to Meadowbrook Estates. Officer Davis's citation and the investigation it sparked had exposed years of corruption and abuse. It had freed dozens of families from harassment and had recovered thousands of dollars that had been stolen from the community. Most importantly, it had taught all of us that we didn't have to accept injustice just because someone claimed authority. The snow kept falling, as it does every winter in Minnesota, but now we faced it together as a real community, not as people living in fear of their own HOA, and that made all the difference.